consisted of trying to stabilize the distributional outcome at the level at which the elites could sustain most of the gains achieved during the dictatorship. Despite being a political minority, it succeeded in doing so. The capitalist elite succeeded during this period in building a hegemonic consensus of the supposed advantages of free market distributional policies. The key question, also in South Africa, is why it was a center-left coalition with clear majority support. Is why it was a center-left coalition with clear majority support could do so little in distributional terms. In other words, why was Strategy 3 so successful for an oligarchy operating within a democracy, even though it was a political minority? End of quote. We define neoliberalism with others as consisting of policies, ideology, and practice, which are not always coherent, but tend to reinforce the power of capital at the expense of labor, and the power of finance capital at the expense of other fractions of capital. Thus, arguing that South Africa represents a case of deepening neoliberalism does not imply that all of its characteristics must be deduced from the initial blueprint. Or, on the contrary, what is interesting is to analyze the particular form, contradictions, and adaptations of neoliberalism in South Africa. The deepening of neoliberalism designates a situation where, as in Chile or in the UK, or indeed in many other countries, the shift to neoliberalism has been initiated by conservative forces, apartheid, Thatcher, Pinochet, but consolidated by a seemingly progressive movement, which was able to use its legitimacy to lock in distributional outcomes which favored incumbent elites. This was in part the result of concessions whose consequences were not properly assessed or were properly concealed, for instance in the case of the guarantee of the pensions of white civil servants. But it also seems, and Ronnie Kasrils has suggested this in a number of recent articles, that much of the ANC leadership which actively supported the continuation of neoliberal policy options in the 1990s, or didn't object to it at least, did not expect such appalling results. In fact, many on the left seem to have been convinced in the 1990s that liberalization would have acted as a disciplining force on the power of large conglomerates. Quite a naive thought in retrospect. It is striking to see the parallel with Brazil's 1994 Plan Real, which introduced a new currency in Brazil, which promised, in the same way as GIA did, jobs to come from investment as a result of trade and capital account liberalization. As in South Africa, capital opted to leave the country en masse, rather than to come in the form of foreign direct investment. Unlike in South Africa, however, some of the disastrous neoliberal policies have been reversed in the 2000s with some success. Aside from differences in policy and state capacity, which cannot be minimized, a key advantage of Brazil over South Africa is the strength and political legitimacy of its industrial capitalists. The key feature of neoliberal deepening in South Africa has been the engineered domination of the national treasury over economic and other areas of policy, combined with unflinching support for orthodox policy options largely placed outside the realm of debate. This has ensured the continuous servicing of the interests of increasingly financialized minerals energy complex companies, while the selective deployment of new public management has conveniently rendered the rest of government toothless in stealing to large corporations, as I think powerfully shown by some of what Trudy and Simon were referring to this morning. The shift to new public management in state reform, directly influenced by New Labour in the UK, in a context of profound state restructuring with enormous capacity issues, has been exacerbated by decentralization. Decentralization is, of course, itself a measure dictated by the need for fiscal restructuring, as testified to in this remarkable quote by Crispin Olber in 1998. He was in charge of designing and implementing decentralization, and that's what he said. South Africa is currently undergoing a major change within its public sector in which government functions, virtually across the board, are being decentralized to the local level. Two forces are driving this decentralization. And the first one is a fiscal squeeze at national and provincial level, leading to the shedding of functions and hence to what we call unfunded mandates being dropped on local government, and the realization that many functions can be provided more efficiently at local level. Here, of course, the naivety of small is beautiful is compensated by some honesty with regard to the real motive behind decentralization. The same could be said of social policies, but the point here is that the idiosyncratic nature of South African neoliberalism lies in its insistence that it takes issues of poverty reduction very seriously. This is premised on a residual view of poverty, as opposed to a relational one. Residual understandings of poverty imply that the poor are poor because they lack something, whether education or capital. Just give it to them or help them get it, perhaps with a little microcredit, and they will do better. Hence the recurrent theme by National Treasury, business, or the mainstream media, the problem in South Africa is microeconomic. This is convenient to divert attention from macroeconomic policy or from the structural factors which hold the country back. Proud among them, its enduring economic structure and low investment rates in anything productive. Indeed, in many respects, apart from the shift to non-racial democracy, the post-apartheid transition is striking by the continuation of many of the late apartheid transformations, which, as Dinga rightly pointed out, were the transformations that signaled the beginnings of a shift to neoliberalism under apartheid. From black economic empowerment, I think that was discussed at length, to privatization of SOEs, and of course the financialization of the economy, actively facilitated by policy. The consequences of this phenomenon have been extensively discussed by Ashman, Klein, and Newman, so I won't dwell on this. But of note, and building on insights by Trudy and Simon, is the domination of the South African economy by capital-intensive firms who are often adverse to diversification in labor-intensive industries, which is precisely what this country would need. Something that I personally witnessed at quite some level when I was doing research on the forestry sector and the way in which it's structured. As a result, since private enterprise is an obstacle-ridden route to accumulation, nepotism and access to tenders and state sinecures has become the prime route to upward social mobility. Indeed, far worse than the culture of entitlement among the poor, the neoliberal alliance between large-scale mining, finance capital, and the ANC has promoted an entitlement mentality among the bourgeoisie. The focus on the poor, who need help, but not too much, has served to cover up for the fact that fantasized drawbacks of the poor, laziness, culture of entitlement, have in fact been bred of the rich, in the end serving primarily the interest of finance capital, which shrugs off Proudhon's or any suggestion that it should be disabled. The way in which the country's corporate structure has been reproduced while creating space for selective inclusion, typically through mining and finance, matters because it explains why industrial capitalists have remained a weak fraction of capital. They are mostly white and unpopular with the dominant coalition, whether capital or the state. It is useful here to quote what Mushtaq Khan says when he reflects on Tanzania's tropism towards big foreign multinationals at the expense of local capitalist development. Tanzania's endowment of black African capitalists is significantly more adverse compared to, say, Kenya's. This is important for understanding why the ruling coalition in Tanzania has been relatively forthcoming in supporting a small number of high-rent foreign investment in minerals, but not very forthcoming about supporting institutional changes which would assist the development of broad-based capitalism in industry or agriculture. The latter strategy, in the absence of strong industrial policies promoting black African capitalism, would almost certainly produce a domestic capitalism with a non-African face. This in turn would be difficult to manage politically. This constraint may help to explain why Tanzania appears to be failing to capitalize on its superior political stability and effective party machine to accelerate an economic transition in the 1980s and beyond. Now, whatever its strengths and weaknesses, there's a growing contestation of the South African social order, which is casting serious doubts about its sustainability, which is making this discussion, I think, even more interesting and relevant. South Africa's inability to increase its growth rates, first and foremost, beyond very modest levels since the 1970s, combined with a very narrow elite coalition which appropriates most and more of what is produced, has made the lack of distribution of existing assets a growing source of contestation. Secondly, the increasing use of democratic institutions as mechanisms of redistribution, and therefore of infighting, is rendering South Africa an increasingly violent democracy, as Karl pointed out in his talk this morning. Thirdly, growing macroeconomic instability is interesting not just because of the macroeconomic threats that it puts on South Africa, but also because it signals the beginning of doubts on the part of big business about the ANC's ability to sustain the current elite coalition, which I think is something quite new. Fourthly, the mounting crisis within the tripartite alliance and within the ANC, with EFF and NUMSA having the potential to attract a large part of the traditional alliance electorate away from it in the mid-future, is not yet at the stage where it can threaten its hold on the state, but could certainly do so in the near future. Last but not least is the deepening crisis of inequality and poverty. Our view on this is very cynical. This has been a problem in South Africa for so long, So it doesn't actually seem likely in and of itself to derail the political settlement. But perhaps it should, we want to ask. And in fact, as Ben Fine likes to say, the problem with inequality and poverty in South Africa is not that it can't go on, it's that it can. Now, to conclude, in spite of its superior explanatory power compared to, for instance, linear neoclassical understandings of the relationship between governance and development, such as Kaufman and the World Bank, there is still, in our view, something crucial missing from the analysis of the North Wallace and Wine-Gas framework. Of course, development is not linear, and yes, violence and how elites coalesce to control it matter. But this isn't sufficient to understand the conditions under which social orders produce growth and development, or don't. In particular, it seems very problematic to draw on methodological individualism to portray elites as equivalents one to the other, regardless of their material and class base. If anything, what classical development economists have taught us is that not all kinds of elites or elite coalitions are developmental. As a result, in our view, North Wallace and Wine-Gas framework doesn't help us understand the weakness of the initial political settlement and the class dynamics which explain why it isn't performing or why it hasn't been able to generate growth. But to a large extent, Mushtaq Khan's political settlement concept does so because it focuses on the kind of capitalists and coalitions which are associated with economic development. Now, the problem with South Africa's development trajectory is not that it has been premised on the elite agreement per se. Just about any developmental trajectory is premised on elite agreements. It is that the class nature of this agreement which has entailed an alignment of the interests of the new elites with the neoliberal restructuring promoted since the 1970s by the dominant elites of the financialized conglomerates. Indeed, far from disciplining conglomerates, the neoliberal support for free market policies has entrenched their power and command over sources of accumulation. So what can be done to put the political settlement in South Africa on a more developmental trajectory? In a provocative paper, as he always does, John Sender, writing about agriculture in the Eastern Cape, calls South African capitalism backward because he says it doesn't produce any of the progressive characteristics of capitalism identified by Marx. Sender's suggestion is that it is urgent to drop what he calls a racism of policies vis-à-vis productive capitalists, whether in agriculture or in industry. Those who have potential to create value and jobs should be supported, regardless of the color of their skin, with suitable reciprocal control mechanisms to ensure that they do not free-ride government support. This is certainly an interesting suggestion, especially if it is combined with serious attempts, away from most current BE practice, at facilitating the emergence of productive African capitalists, whether in agricultural or manufacturing, as suggested by Karl in Tanzania. But are such proposals politically feasible? In a context where the frustration with the lack of racially understood economic liberation is understandably polarizing attention, and giving a wide audience to populist proposals, one can doubt it. Moreover, the neoliberal restructuring of the state, discussed in the papers on macro policy, but also on competition, suggests a very weak capacity for imposing reciprocal control mechanisms on companies. In other words, the state hasn't learned to discipline capital, so why would it be able to discipline manufacturing better than finance? This doesn't mean that successful industrial policy is impossible, but a shift away from new public management and the domination of prudent fiscal policy over all other considerations will certainly be necessary first steps. It is, in our view, the role of political economy scholarship to enrich the understanding of the South African political settlement in order to inform constituencies who may find it acceptable to support, with clear conditions, capitalists who can create decent jobs only when it becomes clear, when it becomes clear that the current dispensation is one which entails unconditional support to capitalists of all complexions, but in particular white, whose rapid enrichment is incompatible with growth and job creation. So we hope to have started to contribute to this and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
What a task. Well done, thanks. As I muttered coming up to speak to you, what a task to deal with this paper in 10 minutes. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and certainly it can't claim to have been able to assimilate it in the half an hour. It's certainly very challenging, very significant and important for us as a country, as a people, and requires a great deal of attention. Thanks very much to the authors. So, South Africa's fragile political settlement, which we're looking at, which we're living through. A country that has been contested by violence for most of its modern history, going right back to colonial incursion into South Africa, the dispossession process, and the very brave wars of resistance coming to a head at the end of the 19th century. The 100-year Xhosa War, frontier wars, the Zulu, Sekekuni, Venda, Sotho-Tswana wars, Griqua wars between the colonialists and our people, the indigenous people, and then of course the very heroic Boer War against British Empire, British colonialism. So we've seen violence as a continuum in our history. In fact, it can be argued that the period from 1994, certainly up to, I would say, Marikana, which for me and for all of us must be a major turning point, back to the imposition of real hegemonic rule through the state on behalf of the mining houses and the mining energy complex.